Welcome, everybody. The subject today is the idea of being able to experience the absolute abundance and fullness of life. It is Midsummer's Day, whether you spell it with a U or an O, as is becoming very in vogue because of the movie. And I will celebrate later by watching the movie tonight. I think I might make that a yearly thing. It's kind of a post-COVID thing. It's still like, instead of going out and celebrating with people, I'm still watching movies. But that's where we're at. I think a lot of us still, and we're slowly coming out into the world, but it has always been traditional in many cultures, particularly the Tibetan Buddhist culture, Shambhala culture that I've worked in and come up in, and in other Buddhist cultures as well. But I think also many indigenous cultures around the world to really celebrate this day as the longest day of the year, the shortest night. This is the day that around Christmas time that we were all waiting for, with all our rituals there about the various light coming practices, because those were the really long nights. And there was a time when humans were that naive that they actually had this connection to their world and connection to their nature, connection to society, so much so that they created rituals that they would then, perhaps appease their gods, or, express their gratitude to their gods or to nature or to situations. There's definitely a thought among anthropologists and in some circles that a lot of what we think were very naive traditions, like, oh, they believed all these superstitions, were not necessarily that superstitious. They weren't necessarily beliefs that people held in a really solid way, but more like that they used them as inspirational prompts to allow them to open their heart and experience gratitude for the world in which they lived and that kind of society. Yes, I'm sure in every culture there are people that take things very literally, and there are people who don't take them at all, really literally, right? Who don't even care necessarily. But it does seem to be the case that in our modern culture, we've become kind of more servants, slaves, subjects of materialism. That seems to be our God, the money, power, prestige, tactile, practical things we could touch, feel, and taste. And failing any of those, we will create concepts that are tactile and real, like things that we go to war over, ideas that we're angry about, or people that we love that we push away from us because of very firm beliefs that we have. Very strange that when we don't have real physical things to cling on to, we will create mental and emotional and conceptual things to cling on to. We will discuss this again. We have discussed it in the past, but I'm touching upon the three lords of materialism, which is a great teaching, and the idea that anything that we give our life over to, we imbue with great power. So when we feel like we need money, money becomes our Lord. And then we're working for money rather than money working for us. But that happens in more subtle ways to people all the time. People give themselves away to an ideology. They believe in some, kind of right-wing ideology, or they believe in their Q theories, or they believe in various ideas that get stuck in their head. But less obviously, we all might fall prey to that, where we actually fall into these belief systems and actually believe things, and we become subservient to those beliefs. We're like, I'm someone that can never get ahead in their life, or I am someone that will never find love in their life. I'm someone that can never be understood by someone. No one ever gets my jokes, and you can guess which one mine is. this old trope of the brain, these belief systems. I have a very dear friend that I do a lot of work with, and they actually will look at me and go, is that true? I find that so infuriating. I want to complain about somebody. Yeah, they didn't get me. They didn't understand me. They didn't, and they'll say, is that really true? And the truth is that kind of bursts a bubble for me. It makes me think, wow, maybe that's not true. Maybe that's my belief system. And I've created this way of making myself feel more comfortable by having this old trope around with me, like dragging an old dead, bear carcass just to prove that I was once a hunter, and having to drag it around the smelly, buggy corpse everywhere with me just to prove that I was virile and masculine at some point in my life, right? We have these ideas about ourselves and our ideas about our culture and our ideas about our structure that we fall prey to. We believe these things. And that's the Lord of speech, we call it. And the other lords of materialism are the physical form that we actually fall prey to, just really giving ourselves away in the beauty of the physical form of other people, or in the denigrating our own physical form and this constant belief that we should be different than we are. And there are so many different ways, very subtly, that we create materialism out of things that were never intended to be material. Interestingly enough, when ancient cultures worshipped nature or worshipped the earth, they assumed a certain transitory nature to that, a certain changing nature. The seasons change in most places. And even in places where seasons didn't really change demonstrably, other things changed. People came and left and died and were reborn. There's always this constant influx of energy, creation and recreation in nature. When we're connected to it, we understand the basic premise of our existence, that we are here for a brief period of time, and that time is quite transitory and it's quite changeable. And there really is very little that we have to hold on to. Well, in defense of that, we will create things, as I said, to hold on to. And those things that we hold on to are actually ego states. They're ways that we create these personalities so that we actually separate ourselves out from the world, because we would rather truncate our world, bring it down to a very small place that we can control, just so that we could stay in control. And then we will have the same fights and the same arguments with the same people again and again, so that we feel that we could eventually best them. And you all know the old saying by Albert Einstein, right? Performing that experiment again and again and expecting different results is a definition of insanity. Insanity in this case is just neurosis. It doesn't have to be exactly psychosis level. It's just believing in things that aren't exactly true because they're more comfortable, even if they're more painful, which is kind of silly and crazy and wonderful, though. Well, wonderful, if you were to look at it like humans are a complicated breed. They really are a strange, strange breed. We're the only ones in all of nature that can't stand ourselves. There really aren't dogs walking down the street going, I'm so ugly, I can't stand myself. There aren't trees all worried that they have a wonky branch from a lightning storm and nobody will like them. Kids won't play on me. Nobody loves me. Humans are the only species, the only form of life, maybe in the entire universe, that can't stand itself, that doesn't like itself, that doesn't accept what's actually here. Now, some of that may be because we have this higher cerebral processing power, which gives us a greater idea of being able to see things to some extent, where animals seeing through the eyes of the gods, you know? And that's a really kind of strange little problem for us. Because on some level, we understand the perception of things as they could be, but on another level, we don't know how to get there. So what we'll do is end up punching our way there, or fighting our way there, or manipulating our way there. And what begins to happen is that that has karmic consequences. Karma not being the reward and punishment way that Western people look at karma, but actually the just cause and effect way of looking at the energy of the universe. The more we do something, the more likely we are to continue to do that thing. The more we have done something in the past, the more likely we are to continue doing that. It's the way the brain organizes itself. Despite all the brilliance and intelligence in the world, we will do the same stupid things again and again and again and again, trying to find different results again and again and again, because our need to control is more important to us than our need to really conjoin, to be part of the world, to actually look at our window and look at a world that's really calling for us to play with it, to come out and dance with it. A world that so desperately needs us and wants us. A world where if we were to give ourselves over to it, would actually receive us with love and with kindness. Well, until it killed us, which eventually it would do. And maybe there's the fear, because eventually the natural order of things will have us die. We'll have our demise. We'll have all of our structures, and everything we've created will crumble and fall, because that is the natural order of things. So the Buddhists suggest start with that right from the get-go. No, that's a hard philosophy to sell. I'll tell you, I have tried to do it. It's a pretty hard one. Let's just start with the fact that we're all going to die, and then work toward joy from there, you know? But that is a very profound way to begin, if you think about it. And Buddha himself thought that that was an important point for his students, to actually acknowledge that this time is temporary, that we're actually in a rental space here, that nobody owns anything, and that everything that we have is actually subject to diminishment and decay at some point. That's a terrible thing. That's a horrible, horrible plan. Whoever would have made that kind of deal? Oh yeah, I'll be born and I won't have any idea where I'm being born into, and I don't have any idea when I'm going to die. I have any idea what's going to happen in between. That's a horrible deal. But unfortunately, it's the only deal. And it's the same deal that birds and trees and flowers and all of nature has made. And the very fact that I'm even joking about the fact that I think it's a bad deal sort of shows this, you know, anthropomorphic kind of chauvinism. I was trying to conflate those terms into a fancy, cool new term. I should have done that before I started the talk. Anthropo-chauvinism. You know, but some idea that we're actually, humans are actually guilty of that kind of entitlement, of which we kind of are now highlighting some cultures. We just assume that our life is preeminent, that we are the most important thing in the universe, because we're the only thing we really know, because we don't pay attention to anything else. We walk around with our ideas, with all these thoughts and all these ideas, and our mind quite truncated down to small little specifics all the time, argumentative little specifics, and we miss the trees, we miss the greenery, we miss the life happening all around us. I am fortunate enough to have these big, huge windows in my room, and every place I've lived, I always get big windows. And the windows that I have right now, true story, and I hope it's okay that I tell you this, but they look out on complete pornography from the bird world. Like, I can't believe how much these little finches hump. They're on the phone lines right outside my window, and they'll be sitting there, two of them together, and you're going, okay, I know it's gonna happen now. And sure enough, one will jump on the other. They'll jump up and down a little bit and shake, and then they'll separate and they'll be fine. It's kind of like, okay, we're done. And then a few minutes later, they'll jump on top of each other again and shake, and then separate out again, and they're fine. And I was thinking, gosh, I would have had so much of a story. I would have been yelling and screaming and crying over my relationship already, you know. I would have been like agonizing over whether this person liked me or didn't like me, all of these things, right? Birds don't really do that. They just do what they need to do, and then they let it go. There's an interesting parallel. That's the humorous parallel around love in the universe, but the same thing is true of hatred and difficulty and fear and trauma in particular. So when an animal becomes traumatized, what it will do is run it off or shake it off. They'll actually physicalize it to move it, so then they can go right back to a place of rest, stasis, and equanimity. So for instance, if an animal is frightened and chased by a predator, it will perhaps outrun the predator and find some safety. But once it does, it will literally shake its body out. Or it will run around sometimes in circles just to get the energy out of the system, move it through their body. The point is, at some point, they just relax and it's gone. They're not carrying the predator around with them in the same way that we will. Even though we don't even face predators, we face emotional difficulties that we relate to as like predatory, you know? And then we believe these stories about ourselves because we carry so much weight and importance, and we also don't know how to let go. So we know how to act out, but we don't know how to let go. You know, the point is, when you feel stressed, you'll come home and knock back a bunch of drinks and then yell at somebody, or just avoid it altogether. Or what are the various ways that we work with stress? Or when we've been hurt, chances are we'll hurt someone else in retaliation, not even the person that hurt us, right? You're constantly passing on that lineage of aggression. I've been hurt, I'm hurting, they're going to hurt somebody in return. Doing this because we think it's alleviating the stress somehow, but it is not. It's acting out. It's not coming in contact with actually how we feel and caring for ourselves and putting ourselves back into wholeness. The 4 stages of putting ourselves back into wholeness are to begin with acceptance. First of all, we just say, okay, I'm freaking out. Okay, let me not add fire to the fire. Let me not add gasoline to this. Let me just create space for this and let it burn out for a moment. Does that make sense? The first stage is the idea of pacifying, that we actually pacify the energy so it calms down. If we're having a difficulty with another person in our life, and we're going to have a conversation with that person, we could do a couple of different things. And one thing, if you're like me, is you'll spend the whole day formulating all of your logics and your complaints and your, legalese, your briefs and everything. So you could be fully armed when you go into the conversation. That is maybe the worst thing to do. You're completely predisposing the whole situation to go completely the wrong way, right? Or maybe it's more manipulative. Maybe you think I'm going to be nice and have flowers and dinner, and it's all going to be this way. But we're predetermining in our mind what we want to have happen, and we are certainly setting ourselves up for disappointment when that happens. The first stage of enlightened activity, the activity of the Buddhas, is pacifying. The color is white. The first stage is just to calm everything down. Calm yourself down, calm the other person down, calm the circumstance down. Does that make sense? So I was trained for a while in kind of a non-violent or non-aggressive form of crowd control and personal guard training with teachers, worked with how to protect teachers without inflaming negative situations. And the first thing we do is calm the situation down. So when we've had unruly people or drunken people at outdoor festivals or something like that, the first thing we do is not attack them or not create a tighter container for them. The first thing we do is create space, have them sit down, have them relax, separate them from the situation, start from the point of view of peacefulness. And we could do that with ourselves. We kind of start with ourselves and be like, oh, okay, I'm freaking out right now. How do I create a sense of calm in my own heart and mind? How do I bring myself back into wholeness? But once we've done that, or we don't even have to have perfected it, but we just start in that direction, the next stage, right, is that we enrich the situation somehow. So when you've gotten the drunk to sit down, the next thing you do is offer them water, right? Or tell them you're happy to see them. When you're talking with somebody that could be a contentious, argumentative situation, why not, after you pacify the situation, get everybody to sit down, maybe do a few minutes of meditation? Why not start with a compliment? If it's honest, why not just say, I'm really, really touched that you agreed to meet me. Thank you so much. Because if we start with an attack, which is the ego's way of looking at it, we're almost assuring that we're going to meet the lowest part of this other person, you know? But if we start with a compliment, we're perhaps raising this person. We're touching their great human potential. We're looking at the part of them that maybe they want to be, and seeing them through the eyes of the Buddha, if you will, seeing them as possible and helpful, kind and open, seeing them through the eyes of your higher power, seeing them through the eyes of God, seeing them as possible rather than problematic. The second stage is called as enriching, where you kind of enrich the situation. You pour tea together. You create some kind of a bond of civility. And then the third stage, magnetizing, is when you actually connect to the subject matter. By then, you're actually connecting. And the idea then is to connect with your heart, if you can. Stay with your heart and stay in the process of pacifying and enriching, where you're trying to find the best in this person, or the best in your world, or the best in yourself, and then open your heart to your fears and your doubts, problems and your complaints at that point, right? And this is what's happening for me. The last stage is called destroying, and the color is black. And the idea of destroying is, once it's over, then it's over. Don't carry your discussion on for the rest of the day. You know what I mean? Like, say, okay, this is our discussion, leave it. That's a big problem couples have a lot. There's no real end to the thing, and it just sort of continues and hangs in space. It's a big problem that I had a lot going out in the world, where I could enjoy life and I could talk about enjoying life, but I never knew when it was time to be over, you know? I would always be the last person at someone's house, which is so embarrassing and annoying, you know? Right? As long as there was more alcohol, or, you know, different parts of my life, maybe more drugs. If there was any chance, anybody in a bathroom doing any activity that could seem interesting to me, I would be there. You know, that's crazy. That's addiction. It's nothing to do with being loved. It has nothing to do with enjoying life. Part of the enjoyment of life is knowing when it's over, you know, and letting go. Pacifying means that we begin everything from a point of view of calm, and openness. Enriching means that we look for the basic goodness, the goodness in anything, and begin to move in that direction, right? Magnetizing means that we're actually willing to connect with our heart in a way that's direct, honest, kind. And then destroying is when it's over, it's over. Not the whole relationship or not our life. It doesn't have to be that dramatic, but just, when the conversation's over, now it's time to go watch, Midsummer, or now it's time to move on to the next thing. Or maybe now it's time for us to have our own individual space, but to be very clear about things. Now, how does this have to do with our conversation today? Well, very, very quickly, I'd like to say that what it is that first we start with acceptance, and then we start with enriching. And this idea of enriching is the idea of equanimity, that we're actually becoming okay with everything as it is, and also reducing our tendency toward judgment. We're just relaxing that tendency toward judgment so that we could actually accept what's there and be part of the world as it is. If it disappoints us, then that's okay. That's something we work with and we go to the next thing. Because if it disappoints us and we freak out, and we go right to destroying and we want out of the thing, right? Then it kind of shows us that maybe our whole premise was starting from an ego point of view. Anyway, I'm sort of ready to turn this over to discussion, but I just want to just also underscore this point. The four dharmas, the four karmas, pacifying, enriching, magnetizing, destroying, are a real kind of process for moving through life that's really helpful. It's like adds a structure. But in the middle of all that, the magnetizing and the enriching, right? The enriching and magnetizing in terms of the formula, are really where we're working. Does that make sense? As soon as we accept that we're freaking out, we try to find the part of us that feels loving kindness and is accepting, and see if we could radiate that out to the world and see if the world doesn't respond in that way. Instead of leading into the world with some sense of demand and expectation, with some sense of threat, some sense of loaded gun. Before I turn it over, of course, I have a little story. It's short. But I was doing a month-long meditation retreat, and the retreat was very painful for me. I was brand new from New York City, and this was up in the country in Colorado, and I was completely out of my element, overwhelmed, and also it was wonderful and tremendous experience. But of the many painful things that occurred to me, one was Erin Lewis, who sat right in front of me for 1 month. And Erin Lewis was a stunningly beautiful woman that actually I could find nothing to discourage my idea that she was not a complete and utter goddess. Like, my brain took that ball and just ran down the field with it. I had 30 days to sit behind her and just imagine what our children would be like, how we would live together. We would move to New York together. I had entire fantasies, because the alternative would have been for me to do the actual program as it was contrived and to actually watch my mind and create some discipline. But that's not really what we do, We actually feel lonely and we feel frightened, and so we create these dramas in our head. And I created this enormous amount of drama in my head, but I finally asked her out. That we had a halfway period where we had a day off, and I asked her if she wanted to hang out with me on the day off. And I did this before the actual day of the day off, like a few days before. And she said yes. And I was out of my mind. I was so happy. I was so happy. I was like a dog. If you remember, if any of you that are old enough to remember this cartoon where this dog would eat a biscuit and then he'd twirl around in the sky because he was so blissed out and happy. And then he would just fall gently down to earth in this complete blissed out sort of state. I was completely blissed. I was so happy. Turned out on the day of the party when we were to hang out, Aaron came up with some excuse to leave and go off with some other people and not to come back to my apartment, or my cabin. And I was crushed. So as elated as I was, then I was crushed and I was beside myself. And I didn't even want to show up for meditation. And then every day, instead of the expectation, I was sitting there staring at the defeat in the form of Aaron Lewis. And I went into my meditation instructor because we would have these one-on-one meetings every week with our instructor. And my instructor was a guy named Barry Milner, who was really brilliant, kind of well-practiced dude, but very soft-spoken and didn't really say too much. He was a jazz musician. He had that affect. And I was talking to him, explaining the whole thing, and I'm crying, and I'm so like emotional and so intense about it all. And I'm looking down, and the whole time he's sitting there holding it's his hand making a gun, right? And he's just holding it there. And finally, at some point, I just looked at it, and he kind of looked at me and he winked, and he's looking at the gun. And I'm like, what? What? And he goes, people can always sense the smoking gun you're carrying, you know? They always know all the baggage you've got inside. They can always tell that this is going to be way more complicated than you're expressing it to be, because you've gone through all of this emotional stuff about it, right? And I just didn't know how to respond to that. And about the third weekend, I decided to leave, and I decided to just leave the meditation, and I just went storming out. There was a back door, and I just got up in the middle of the sitting, and I went storming out the back door, and Barry happened to be there at the door, sort of strangely. And he looked at me and goes, "Where are you going?" And I go, "Back to New York." And I just kept walking. And over my shoulder, I hear him say, "Do you think it's going to get any better then?" And it just cut my momentum. And that exactly is how the path works, really. It's like somebody doesn't tell you what to do or that you're doing it wrong, because then you'll just fight that. But it's just breaking the momentum a little bit. It was like, is it going to be any better there? And it just caused me to stop. And I sat down outside for a bit. And I smoked in those days. I lit myself a cigarette, and I just sat there and I went, it's not. This is the way I've tortured myself all my life. And I'm just going to keep torturing myself this way. I'm going to keep living in all these dramas in my mind because I'm too bored with just being with myself. I find it too boring and incomplete to just be with me, And as long as we do that, then we actually will always get ourselves into addictive, difficult situations, I think.